Great, thank you very much. Last speaker, you're on the final straight, so well done. Look, I'm not sure if you've heard the saying, but it's been said that Sydney is a city of haves and have yachts. It's a city that also has a love affair with houses. I'm not sure if there's many people here from Melbourne, but if you go to Melbourne, you speak about the weather and you speak about the football. As every Sydney-sider knows, you go to a dinner party, you speak about property. And if you go to a really good dinner party, you speak about harbour views. So, look, it's no surprise then that if I told you that we are in the midst of a housing affordability crisis here in Australia, particularly in Sydney, but nationwide. And I'm not just talking about going to an auction, well-heeled people going to an auction and it goes for $1.2 million and they're just beyond their budget. I'm talking about affordability crisis that is actually hitting those that are most marginalised the hardest. That people that really are in danger of not really having a place that they can afford to live, to rent or to own. And really, when we think about it, it is a national disgrace because we now, Australians, officially build the biggest houses in the world. And at the same time, we have people that are homeless and at risk of homeless. And we also have communities that are broken in the sense that we are now living closer to each other than we ever have. And we're probably having less to do with our neighbours and less to do with our community than we ever have. It's kind of that thing, you live in an apartment, you're in the elevator, your neighbour says, hold that lift, and you're inclusive, kind of that inner wish to do something is to press the close button on the elevator. You don't want a conversation, you want to keep your life apart. So before I want to go into this housing affordability crisis a bit more, but let me tell you a little bit about the journey I want to take you on. This won't be a very PowerPoint-heavy presentation. I figured you're probably death by PowerPoint at the end of the day for the last session. But I want to talk about the scale of the housing crisis here in Australia. I want to also talk about the more severe crisis that's happening across Southeast Asia in terms of shelter. You can probably imagine, but some of the figures are quite extraordinary. And then I want to tell you why governments are hopeless. Governments don't have the money to fix it. If we're looking at governments to fix it, we're in a world of trouble. And in fact, the reason we have a crisis now is because governments can't fix it. And I also want to talk about why not-for-profits are constrained as well. There's a real role for not-for-profits, thank goodness, for me and for Jess and others, well, for social businesses as well. But there are constraints, particularly on not-for-profits, and I want to talk a little bit about that. But ultimately, I want to talk about why corporates are the key. And I don't want to talk about, I think we've been talking about CSR and bottom of the pyramid stuff for about 20 years now. I don't want to talk about that kind of thing. I want to talk about corporates playing a role in what is essentially a grand compact with private, public, people partnerships. And we believe it can empower a number of things. We think it can actually help repair broken communities. We think by doing this, we can unleash the power of volunteering, both at a community and a corporate sense. And we can create and generate innovation to create new mechanisms to actually start to fund some of the infrastructure we need, both here in Australia and overseas. Look, I'm finally changing a slide in the PowerPoint, hopefully. So let's come back briefly. I won't bombard you with figures, but when we look at the housing crisis in Australia, every night about 100,000 people will be homeless. Now, you might think of a homeless person as someone who's on a city street, sleeping on a park bench with a probably poor quality bottle of port or something. That really represents about 10% of homelessness in Australia. The vast bulk of it's hidden. Most of it is women escaping domestic violence with children. Some of them are living in their cars, others are with friends, but many of them are without safe, suitable housing. And many times more than those people are on the brink, possibly 4 times as many as 100,000 are on the brink of homelessness because of the stress trying to pay a mortgage or trying to pay rent is causing. And you know about Housing Commission or government subsidised housing. In New South Wales, if you're trying to get, in some parts of New South Wales, just a 2-3 bedroom house for your family at a subsidised level, the wait is something like 10 years. So there's not much hope there for you. And pretty much, given house prices in most of Australia, not just Sydney, you know, the hope of a low-income family owning a house is pretty much nil these days. So it's pretty bleak. I will try to cheer you up a little bit later as we get into this presentation. I'm going to depress you a little bit more. The housing crisis in Asia, less well known, but pretty much the big cities in Asia are struggling under what is essentially uncontrolled population growth. There's been a massive migration from people in rural areas going to the city. In fact, the UN says in something like 2007, for the first time in the history of mankind, more people lived in cities than they did in rural areas. And people are going because there's job opportunities and economies in Asia, the developing economies are expanding, so it's not necessarily a bad thing, but there's no houses for them to live in. Pretty much something like 500 million people live in slums. That's a picture of probably a pretty good slum. I'm not sure if many people have managed to go to a slum. The smell particularly is extraordinary. Perhaps you saw Slumdog Millionaire. It'll give you an idea of the scale of some of the slums that are happening. Some of the biggest are in Asia, in the Philippines, and obviously that one was, I think, in Mumbai. And they're growing at a rate of 2 people moving into a city in Southeast Asia every second. At one stage we did a population counter on our website to try to show it, and it was just constantly spinning. It gives you an idea of the challenge. In fact, the UN is saying it's the biggest development challenge of the 21st century, because 10, 20 years ago, a poor person, like someone who was really on the brink of poverty, was more than likely to be in Africa, in a poor country. They were probably a child orphaned by AIDS, and they were probably in a rural area suffering from famine. Today, the face of poverty is much more around an urban setting in a middle-income country. So you're trying to fight poverty in a country, say, like India, which has a nuclear program, it has a space program. I think it has more millionaires than the population of Australia, and it has a malnutrition rate that's higher than Africa, and it has a huge housing crisis. So there's all sorts of problems about how we respond to this, and I guess by ignoring it, there are tremendous economic and social implications for countries throughout Asia, and because we increasingly rely on Asia, there's incredible implications for us economically, and perhaps less so socially, but economically for Australia. So it's an issue that we can't ignore. But I freely admit this is a massive problem, and you're probably sitting here thinking, look, mate, you're the last speaker, you're giving us these massive problems, what are you doing, what are we meant to do? Let me tell you a little bit about the fact that these massive problems can actually be solved. When we think back in 1990, one of the big challenges was the number of children that were dying before their 5th birthday of a preventable disease. So you've probably heard of the Make Poverty History campaign. Pretty much in 1990, 12 million kids died before their 5th birthday, 12 million a year. There was a lukewarm effort, to be honest, but there was an effort by governments and aid agencies to get vaccination, to get mosquito nets, to get vitamin supplements, and it's had a massive impact. So in 2013, they took a similar census and they'd been halved. So the number of kids dying before their 5th birthday, every day there's 17,000 more kids that are actually living and having a decent life because of this effort. And when you think of, it wasn't a huge amount of resources that were put into this, but if you think of perhaps the resources and the intellectual know-how of a Coca-Cola that manages to get its product cold to every corner of the globe, it gives you a sense, I guess, of the drive and the vision and the innovation that business can bring to something that can make a massive difference. Look, I think the other thing that's been shown too is in continents like Africa, where technology and business, through the implementation of mobile phone technology, where it skipped a whole generation. They didn't bother with landlines because they were so behind, and by the time they got to a point where they could put landlines in, the mobile phone was sweeping the world. And the penetration within countries, in poor countries in Africa and throughout Asia, is extraordinary. And the potential for that to deliver not only communications, but health advice, services, education, is truly exceptional. So there are solutions to some of these big, intractable problems. What's clear, though, is that government don't have the solutions. These governments in Australia increasingly are cutting budgets, and in Asia, where the problem is the worst, the governments are the poorest. I think I also mentioned that not-for-profits are also limited. I'm not sure if you've heard of Dan Paletta. He's a US entrepreneur who's also a humanitarian. In fact, his TED Talk, I think, had 3 million hits. It's an extraordinary talk that he looks at why not-for-profits can't do what they're meant to do. Essentially, he agrees with me. It's good that I agree with someone who has 3 million hits, or he agrees with me, that not-for-profits have a role, that no matter what we do, there'll always be 10% of a population that miss out on the bottom of the pyramid, I guess, and really you're not going to have a market solution. There will always be a role for not-for-profits to help those who can't be involved in the market. But he also said that too much focus on not-for-profits is put on reducing costs, like watching your overheads, watching how much you spend on admin. And really, you lose sight of the cause because you're under so much pressure to keep things down and to not be seen as wasting money. To create innovation and to truly solve problems in that context is almost impossible. I know we've been talking to a number of companies at Habitat, and the idea of whether we could interest a corporate in being an innovation partner, not where you'd be unaccountable, where it's give us some money and we'll innovate and go away, but to really understand the process of innovation, the fact that it may not necessarily end with the building of X number of houses at the end of 1 year, but it may actually go to solving a broader problem. And it's something that we think will have real scope for us. Having said that, not-for-profits are constrained. Look, Habitat for Humanity, let me tell you a little bit about it. It's a little bit more innovative than most. Its mission is simple. It's essentially that everyone deserves a decent, safe place to live. Habitat started small. One man who was a millionaire had his marketing business. His life was miserable. His wife threatened to divorce him unless he sold the business and gave the money to the poor. Haven't told my wife that story yet. But he did. He sold the business. They worked in the 60s helping very poor communities build houses and working with communities and volunteers, and later went on to Africa. But Habitat now is so big, and you may not have heard of it in Australia, but it's said that every 4 minutes, somewhere in the world, Habitat would help build a house, repair a house, or renovate a house for a poor community. One of the key things, though, that is innovative about Habitat for Humanity is this idea of trying to encourage social ownership. So instead of cheaper rents, trying to get a mechanism for people to own their own home. Part of that is that the person that may benefit really puts in themselves. So we have sweat equity. They'd put in 500 hours sweat equity into it. Also, we would be very strong on community volunteering. It's a community-based process, and having people that come in and volunteer, and also to have corporates volunteer, and also to provide resources to keep the value of the house down. We also advocate for cheaper housing, and that doesn't mean you can't have a bit of fun. We did a fake website called Real Value Housing. I'm not sure if you can read the text below that, but it looks at the joys of lakeside living. And it's a community that's a slum pretty much on the water in Cambodia. And you click through that and it talks about not what you're expecting, and it gives some details. It was picked up by News Limited, and it was really powerful in helping us explain some of the situations. Now, I'm conscious of the time. Let me get to some solutions around, first of all, in the housing crisis in Australia. We do need to tap into market mechanisms. We do need to harness innovation and the resource and the expertise of business. We don't believe the key is to just build more rental stock. We think we need to create a new front in the war on housing affordability in Australia, and it has to be around creating social opportunities. So in Australia, we work to provide, we work with the community, we'd work with a family, and we would provide some funding for them, but essentially we would help build their house at a cheaper rate. And from there, we would look to unlock much more power in terms of the cost of this house. So there's a scheme in the US, let me say, that for every $1 a government puts in, they return $7 in value. So essentially you get the community around, you help build the house, you keep the value low, and then the other thing that we're looking at to do to really expand this is the idea of shared equity. So a mortgage provider may not be willing to give someone enough money for a mortgage on a house, even a discounted house, but they may give 70 or 80%. And we're looking at providing that difference, whether it's through not-for-profits, whether it's through business, and perhaps through the idea of a rotating fund. And we think through shared equity, through perhaps the involvement of government in providing cheaper land, but certainly through the idea of corporates, there's a real opportunity to encourage social ownership in Australia, particularly for the working poor in Australia. In terms of Southeast Asia, companies can play a really key role in filling the gap with that governments aren't funding in Asia. To form public-private partnerships, essentially to create new affordable housing stock across Asia. Companies that have financial, construction, planning, project management, that have a footprint in Asia are really well placed. Now, I know that's not everyone here, but companies that are in those sectors, there's massive opportunities to side together with governments, with not-for-profits, to work with communities. The fact that the Australian government aid policy is also looking at the role of corporates in delivering aid also makes this much more of an option. But also, through Habitat, we do a lot of volunteering. So any company could look to volunteer overseas to help build a house. In fact, there's one professional services company that we're working with that is taking 100 of its senior partners to Cambodia. Now, this is part of a national conference, but rather than just doing a golf day or rather just going to a resort and sitting in a pool, as part of it, they're going to build 5 to 10 houses for a very poor community in Cambodia. And our experience shows through companies that the team building that happens within that, the fact that people are taken out of their comfort zone, and the fact that it makes a massive difference to families and communities has a huge impact and a huge benefit for the company. Let me just finish. In terms of innovation, look, I can't stand up here and do a PowerPoint and say these are all the innovative things you should be doing. You can't pre-package innovation. It needs to be a partnership in which we sit together and we work out some of the solutions that could come to some of these big intractable problems. But if your company potentially identifies with whether it's the housing crisis, whether it's the want to empower communities again, to give back to communities, or even just to provide opportunities to staff that go beyond perhaps what you'd normally do, there's a real opportunity to come together. We have struck a deal, a partnership with Boral, which has been amazing. Now, Boral's a big building services company. It has a footprint in Asia. Perhaps it's a no-brainer. But it's amazing as you talk with them, the opportunities that come out that you'd never think of. The peer-to-peer discussions that happens here in Australia and overseas means that there's a level of innovation that we would never have thought. And I guess that's what I'd like to encourage you, whether it's through Habitat or whether it's through other agencies, but to go on that journey where you're looking at wanting to make a difference, partnering with organisations that can connect you with communities to provide a whole level of social innovation that can really change lives. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. I found the source of the word sweat equity, which I've heard Alan use on more than one occasion when he's talking about his own house, I think. But I think any questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Kathy Killen from University of Technology. I'm just curious, I am very keen in this whole space, but looking at your examples, they're all single-family dwellings. And I'm just aware of the fact that in our city and in most bigger cities, it's really necessary to reduce our ecological footprint and to take advantage of infrastructure and do multi-story, multi-family dwellings.
Yeah.
Are you involved in those? How does that work with your
Look, we are in some countries, definitely. Not in Australia. We've been doing single dwellings in Australia. But what we have been doing, I guess, is to make sure that the process is community-led. So in some cases where we talk to a community and they say, look, there are families that have housing issues, but perhaps the bigger issue may be a centre for women that are homeless or a community centre. So we'll actually use that process to do a community centre. So in Nowra, there's accommodation that we're building with the community, a local chapter, that's providing accommodation for people with disabilities. I think it's as a halfway house as they develop skills and they settle in before they go on. So we try to make it community-led. If it's not owned by the community, we try to have as big an impact as possible. But there is also an element that we believe if we can get the model right and if it can be replicable through other agencies as well as ourselves, and particularly with access to cheaper government land in some areas, the scale can grow enormously. We just believe social ownership and whatever it happens, whether it changes through the tax system, whether it's through these things, is something that needs to be explored as well as increasing the rent, the access to cheaper rental accommodation.
I mean, I guess multi-family dwellings don't have to be rented, though. They could be owned.
No, that's true, yeah. And look, I mean, there have been cases where we're talking to developers as well in terms of access to it, but we're not doing multi-level or significant high density yet. I mean, I think it's something we'll need to look at. We're always looking at impact, I guess, and having a maximum impact.
All part of the picture.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting.
There was another question.
Yeah, hi. Monique Cornish from EY. And perhaps a comment for the previous speaker as well. I'm wondering, with the corporate partnerships that you're pursuing, if you've explored really creating shared value rather than just tapping in to the more traditional CSR strategy. Like I can see for Boral, this would fit perfectly for them in terms of CSR. But have you looked at taking it to that next level that will really help you create the revenue and the products you're looking for, but also keep those partners with you for the next 20 years because there's real value?
And you're right, we found they're the most successful partnerships for us. So Boral's a good one. Other organisations that we've been involved in, particularly where they have, in our context, I guess, a desire to expand into an Asian market has been a really big one for us because you're working with the community, it actually provides them an insight into that community and the needs, so it does open up new markets for them as well. It also allows them to give back to communities where they're drawing big workforces from. So one company has a big call centre in the Philippines, and likewise to be able to give back into that community. So we do find that. The one point that we do help engage, I guess, with the company at any level or any business is really, I guess, that volunteering of staff, because that's something that can happen with 12 people, to be able to take them on a global village build that we talk about, where they'd go over and for 5 days they'd build a house for someone in a poor community like Cambodia. And the benefits we found both at increasing the loyalty of the company, but the personal impact that's been quite profound as well. So. But no, I take your point. With the shared value, there's such a fruition of ideas when you're sitting around the table with them that it creates this almost third dimension that you get all those ideas. So you're absolutely right.
Miriam Creek at Food Innovation Australia. I'm actually quite interested in terms of the charities upskilling. One thing I suppose struggle with when we're just giving somebody something, what are you leaving behind and how they're then translating those skills to go off and be self-sustainable.
So in the communities we work in?
Correct. Yeah,
so in every case, so particularly in overseas, we work with local tradesmen as well and local communities, so there's a training process that happens alongside.
But I'm actually thinking more about the people that you built the house for. So as far as I'm concerned, they're getting a house, but then what are they doing in terms of translating that skill to actually helping someone else? That's that sort of social good.
Yeah. So in some cases there is that commitment that they also participate in future builds and they're also involved in the community. I guess one of the key things though is their community chapters that these people are drawn out as well. So there is an involvement in the community with this issue as well. So.
I'm sorry, just from...
Am I missing the question?
Well, no, I mean, to me...
The legacy,
I mean, the idea of charities that you give someone a capability or a skill that they can then go off and be self-sufficient. Otherwise, it's a handout. So it's about teaching them something. So I suppose I'm thinking, you've helped somebody get a house, so why couldn't you, those people that you've helped out, they then go on in terms of the skill that they've been upskilled to then go on and build another house for someone else? To me, that would be great outcome of your...
So I think that certainly does happen because they're working within a local chapter which they then go for the next house build. I think the other thing though with a house too, which doesn't go to the training thing, but is an asset that stays in the family and allows perhaps for the first time many people to hold down jobs and others that they haven't been able to before, to have kids much more successful in their schooling, etc.
There was another
Hi,
question.
yeah, so Nathan from Baxter. There's a lot of opportunity to innovate in actually developing properties, so like cob housing, underground housing, shipping container housing. Is that something that you guys sort of drive, or is that distant from your role in the whole process?
Yeah. Prefabrication. I think there's. We were talking to a group the other day called Tiny Homes, I think, as well. We come across it a fair bit, and we're keen to pursue it. In many cases, it depends on the context with each community. But I think reducing the build cost is a massive issue for us. The other one is access to land. And we've had some really good discussions with developers and local councils that have provided, as part of big developments, a kind of a social ownership kind of allocation within what they're building as well. But that innovation is really interesting, particularly around the homelessness. You do run into issues around council approval and different things, but we're certainly exploring with a number of companies currently.
Thank you very much, Martin.